In 1855, the United States was still patching itself together with thread and string. Railroads were unfinished, cities rose like mushrooms after rain, and mail delivery was one of the few things that actually tried to keep everything connected. But if you imagined a proud, uniformed gentleman trotting on horseback with a leather satchel and a crisp sense of duty, you're about to be very disappointed. The rural mailman of 1855 was not glamorous. He was muddy. He was bitten. He was tired. And he smelled vaguely like lard, tobacco, and wet wool. His boots leaked. His coat was too small. And no matter how early he started, he was always behind schedule. That's because the American countryside was not a pleasant, pastoral walk. It was an obstacle course of angry livestock, collapsing fences, slushy roads, and, most famously, territorial animals. Let's begin with the basics. Postal delivery in the mid-19th century meant hours of trudging along rough, uneven routes, especially in the frontier towns and outlying settlements. These routes were not paved streets. Sometimes they weren't even paths. They were foot-worn trails beside creeks, frozen over cow tracks, or, in a pinch, just someone's cabbage field. Mailmen were expected to complete their rounds in all seasons, regardless of whether the road was knee-deep in mud or frozen into ruts sharp enough to cut leather. And the houses they delivered to weren't exactly welcoming, either. Most homes didn't have mailboxes yet. That's a detail we take for granted today. In 1855, mailmen had to knock, or yell, and hope someone inside heard them. Or worse, they had to get past the true guardians of the homestead. It is here that our story turns beastly. Dogs were the first problem. And not just any dogs, we're talking about actual working farm dogs, shaggy collies, muscular mastiffs, barnyard mutts that had been bred to defend chickens from foxes and children from strangers. These dogs didn't like outsiders. And mailmen, with their swinging satchels and suspicious footsteps, fit the bill. It didn't help that the mailman was a regular presence. Strangers are unsettling. But strangers who return every Tuesday are an outright threat. Dogs learned to anticipate the mailman's approach, and they began organizing themselves accordingly. Some lay in wait behind barrels. Others leapt fences they had never previously attempted. Mailmen began carrying sticks. Some brought bones. One clever carrier in Illinois reportedly carried pork rind in his pocket and tossed it like a smoke bomb before making his escape. But while dogs were expected enemies, geese came as more of a surprise. Now, geese may not sound like much. You're thinking of them honking peacefully by a pond. But the domestic goose of 1855 was no gentle creature. They were raised for meat, yes, but also as living alarm systems. Before modern security systems, before motion lights and warning bells, rural families kept geese. Geese do not miss a stranger's approach. And they do not forgive it. Mailmen reported entire flocks charging them like cavalry. The geese didn't just honk. They screamed. They bit. They flapped wings like sabers and drove full-grown men backward into thorn bushes. One particularly traumatized carrier in Pennsylvania described a goose that watched the road from atop a barrel, then slid down it to chase me, wings extended like some white devil. Many mailmen began to dread certain houses. Not because of the people. Because of the animals. A particularly long driveway might contain both barking dogs and screaming geese, a cruel combination of fur and feathers. And if you dropped the letters, you'd have to go back and pick them up, sometimes while fending off a beak. There were attempts to regulate the chaos. Some postmasters sent out polite reminders, please tether your dogs on post days. But most families ignored them. After all, it wasn't their problem. They liked their animals loud and mean. It kept burglars and beggars away. Unfortunately, it also kept the mail away. So mailmen developed tricks. They learned which fences were climbable and which weren't. They memorized which dogs could be bribed and which had to be distracted. One man carried a small whistle that made a sound geese found unpleasant. Another tied jangling bells to his boots so he wouldn't startle animals, or humans, by surprise. Still, none of this guaranteed safety. Every morning was a gamble. Would it be the Labrador behind the woodpile? Or the goose under the porch? The mailman stepped lightly, breathed slowly, and kept one hand on his satchel, and the other on his walking stick. And that, dear listener, is how the noble act of mail delivery in 1855 became something closer to gladiatorial sport. There were days when it all seemed manageable. The sun rose quietly. The wind didn't shout. Even the dogs, for some reason, stayed curled up beneath porches. But those were rare. Most mornings in 1855 began with something leaking. The roof, the boots, the sky, and something barking. Imagine waking up before dawn in a room no bigger than a chicken coop. Your wool socks are damp because everything is damp. You fumble for your kerosene lamp and find that it's empty. So you dress in the dark. Your coat, which once belonged to your cousin who once delivered soap, no longer closes. Your satchel, patched 3 times, sags on one side like a wounded goat. Outside, the wind is angry and personal. The roads are wet with something that isn't quite water. The sky spits drizzle like it's chewing it first. You haven't had breakfast because you're already late. And there, in the distance, is the first house of the day, with a long, slow driveway and a gate that hasn't opened properly since the administration of Andrew Jackson. You know what waits beyond that gate. Every mailman did. In every village, there was that house. The one with the snorting bulldog, the mute boy who threw rocks, the widow who stared at you without blinking. And, of course, the Goose. The one they called Napoleon. Mailmen told stories about him. He had a bent wing and a scar across one eye, from what, nobody knew. But he didn't just hiss. He charged. If you dared to set 1 foot on the property, he'd descend like a white-feathered cannonball, wings out, neck stretched like a spear. No amount of pork rinds could sway him. One letter carrier claimed Napoleon had actually waited behind a pile of firewood and launched himself like a trapdoor spider. No one disputed it. So you stand at the edge of the gate, holding 3 folded letters and a damp newsletter about turnip prices. You breathe in. You step forward. The gate creaks like it's announcing your presence to the whole county. You close it slowly, too slowly. The dog inside the house begins to bark. The geese begin to shuffle. You hear something splash behind the woodpile. That's not a good sign. You pick up your pace, trying to look casual, non-threatening, like a man who isn't here to disrupt anyone's poultry. You reach the porch. The letters are slightly crumpled now, your fingers too cold to hold them right. You knock once, twice, nothing. Then you hear it. That horrible, high-pitched, triumphant squawk. Napoleon. You turn, just in time to see him waddle around the corner like he owns the property. Which, in a way, he does. His wings flare. His eyes narrow. And you realize, this might be it. This might be the day. You drop the letters into the wooden basket and begin walking, briskly, but with dignity. Napoleon picks up speed. You pick up speed. He honks. You run. Your satchel bounces. Your boot catches on a root. You nearly fall. You slam the gate behind you just in time. He slams into it, flapping like a thunderstorm in miniature. You pause, panting, soaked, humiliated. Napoleon stands on the other side of the gate, victorious. A white feather sticks to the top rail like a flag. You nod at him. He honks. The day has only just begun. Now, of course, not every route was goose-haunted. Some were just long, stretching across cornfields, threading through woods, weaving along rivers. Mailmen would walk 5, 10, sometimes 15 miles a day, in boots that were little more than stitched excuses. There were no official uniforms yet. Each mailman wore what he had, coats inherited from fathers, hats borrowed from neighbors, scarves that once belonged to their wives before they unraveled. And there were other dangers, too. Rusted mailboxes with sharp lids. Sheds with collapsing roofs. Tree roots that snagged your feet. One mailman in Ohio tripped over a hog and fell into a feed trough. Another slipped on cabbage leaves while trying to outrun a rooster. Then there were the things people left out. Buckets, tools, laundry baskets in the path. One postman nearly drowned when he tripped over a milk jug and fell into a rain barrel. His letters floated for hours before someone fished them out and laid them on a stove to dry. It would have been funny, if it weren't so miserable. Still, the mail had to go through. Letters were lifelines. Even the smallest note, a scrawled line about a new baby, a misspelled recipe, a doodle from a cousin, reminded people that they weren't alone on their isolated patches of land. And so the mailman continued. Through storms, geese, fences, and fog, they carried ink on paper like it was gold dust. Because in 1855, it kind of was. By the time a mailman reached midday, he'd already had 2 near-death experiences, a dozen insults from livestock, and half a biscuit crumbling in his pocket. his lunch, if he was lucky. But the most remarkable thing about the mailmen of 1855 was not that they suffered. It's that they adapted. Not officially, of course. There were no training manuals or safety courses. The U.S. Post Office didn't hand out pamphlets titled, "What to Do When a Goose Hunts You Like Prey." No. These were lessons learned the hard way, passed down between carriers like secret folklore. New recruits were warned. Don't look the collie in the eye. Step sideways when exiting the Thompson Gate. It's loose on the left. Never whistle near the Ludlow pig pen. They think it's feeding time. The veterans said these things with tired eyes and patched trousers. And the new mailman, fresh-faced and hopeful, learned fast. Take, for instance, the mailbag. You'd think it was just a sack for holding envelopes. But no, the smart mailman treated it like a shield, a decoy, even a distraction. One clever fellow in Iowa reinforced his bag with a sheet of tin. He claimed it stopped a goose mid-flight. Others stuffed the front of the satchel with straw or cloth to soften the impact when a dog lunged. Then came the bribes. Oh, the bribes. Carriers carried everything from dried meat to sugar cubes. One kept sardines in a pouch, a horrid idea in summer, but highly effective on farm cats. Bones were currency. Biscuits, a peace offering. It wasn't unusual to see a mailman digging in his pocket like a magician just to buy himself 5 safe steps to the porch. Geese, of course, were harder to fool. Dogs might be bribed. Cows could be led around. But a goose, that creature had pride. Mailmen tried everything, shiny objects, bits of corn, soft singing. One even brought a pocket mirror, thinking it might confuse the bird with its own reflection. The goose bit him anyway. And let's not forget the weather. Rain turned dirt tracks into pudding. Snow buried fences. Ice formed invisible slides across wooden bridges. In the summer, dust swirled so thick it turned eyelashes white. Mailmen learned to wrap letters in wax paper, then cloth, then sometimes a second layer of wax paper, all before stuffing them into their already overstuffed satchel. Ink smeared. Seals broke. Paper warped. But somehow, most of it still got through. Sometimes, though, the threat wasn't outside the house, it was inside. Certain households came with personal complications. Old Miss Crampton, for example, who insisted on reading every letter aloud to the mailman, even the ones not addressed to her. Or Mr. Winslow, who'd been expecting a package every day since 1839 and refused to believe it wasn't coming. He once accused a mailman of hiding it in his trousers. Then there was the matter of homemade hospitality. A surprising number of housewives felt sorry for the carriers. Perhaps it was the dripping coat or the limping gait. Perhaps it was the way they stood, soaked and windblown, like scarecrows at the door. So they offered things. A sip of warm cider. A dry muffin. Sometimes a damp rag to clean a bite wound. One mailman in Vermont said he'd accepted at least 30 cups of lukewarm tea from women who never once asked my name. Another said he feared accepting anything in summer, because half the pies are crawling by the time you sit down. There was etiquette, of course. Refusing hospitality was rude. But accepting it was risky. Mailmen developed tricks, pretending to eat, hiding biscuits in their coat sleeve, sipping just enough to be polite without swallowing anything mysterious. No one wanted to explain to their supervisor that they'd missed the afternoon route because of Mrs. Ellsworth's experimental gooseberry cordial. Still, there were sweet moments. A child would wave from a window. A farmer might offer a seat by the fire for 5 minutes of silence. Once in a while, a dog that had previously tried to chew your boot would wag its tail instead. And, on very rare occasions, someone might actually say, "Thank you for bringing the mail." But no matter how polite or pleasant a household might be, the rule remained, always stay alert. A goose could be lurking. A dog could be watching. A toddler could throw a spoon at your head for no reason. Mailmen became experts in body language, not of people, but of animals. They knew when a cow was about to lurch, when a rooster was sizing them up, when a goat had murder in its eyes. Some could hear the flutter of wings before the attack. Others learned to predict which porches were safe and which ones creaked like betrayal. By the end of the day, they returned home with sore knees, sore feet, and stories. Always stories. About letters dropped in pig pens, about angry squirrels in chimney flues, about widows who answered the door with shotguns because they thought the mailman was the tax man in disguise. In towns across America, the mail still arrived. Not on time, not clean, and not unbitten. But it arrived. If the geese didn't kill you, and the dogs didn't maul you, and the ladders didn't collapse under you, then the paycheck just might. Because here's the cruelest twist in the mailman's tale. He was paid like a man who delivered dreams, but fed like a man who swept stables. In 1855, most rural carriers were not salaried government employees. They were contractors. That is to say, disposable. You see, back then, the U.S. Post Office didn't hire mailmen directly for every route. Instead, they auctioned off delivery contracts to the lowest bidder. These were known as star routes, so called because the government would mark them with 3 asterisks. Asterisk, 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 shorthand for celerity, certainty, and security. Though to the men who walked them, those stars might as well have meant cold, cursed, and confusing. Anyone could bid on a star route. If you promised to deliver the mail on time and for less money than the other guy, the contract was yours. Whether or not you had the shoes, the stamina, or the sanity to finish the job, that was your business. If you failed, the post office would simply find someone else. This meant many mailmen were desperate men. Farmers with bad harvests. Civil War veterans with half a pension. Teenagers with no trade. One was a one-eyed blacksmith. Another was a retired actor with a limp. They took the job because it was something, and they kept it because nothing else in town paid even that much. And how much was that much, you ask? A few dollars per month. Sometimes less than $1 per day. For that, they walked 10 to 20 miles daily, carried 40 pounds of mail in a satchel stitched together from feed sacks, and fought off animals like they were extras in a barnyard version of the Odyssey. No uniforms. No health insurance. No reimbursement for boots shredded by barbed wire or coats ruined by sleet. If your dog bite got infected, you wrapped it in a potato peel and hoped for the best. What's more, they had to provide their own transport if the route was long enough. So if you wanted to ride a horse, you bought the horse. You fed the horse. You replaced the horse if it got spooked by a rooster and ran into a ditch, which was more common than you'd think. One mailman who couldn't afford a horse tried delivering mail with a donkey named Lazius. Lazius, unfortunately, hated letters. He bit the satchel so often that half the town's correspondence arrived with bite marks, and a few envelopes simply disappeared, chewed beyond redemption. The mailman was fined for damaging federal property. He later tried using a wheelbarrow. It didn't go well. Then there were the rules. Endless, exhausting rules. Mail had to be sorted properly, even if you were sorting it on a stump during a thunderstorm. You had to arrive at each drop point within an acceptable window, even if a goose blocked the porch and wouldn't move for 20 minutes. And you were forbidden from reading the mail, even if the letter was half open, soaking wet, and smelled faintly of pickled herring. If you missed a house, you could be reported. If you were late more than twice a month, your contract could be revoked. And if someone accused you of stealing even a single penny stamp, you were out, possibly even jailed. So mailmen developed paranoia. They kept meticulous logs. They asked recipients to initial delivery slips. One even carved tiny symbols into fence posts to remember which houses had dogs with names, and which ones had the quiet kind. The silent ones that waited, still as statues, until your back was turned. Still, for all the hardship, there was a strange pride to it. Being the mailman gave a man a kind of crooked authority. Everyone in town knew your face. You knew whose cousin was getting married, who had a brother in New York, who was waiting on a recipe, a sketch, a court summons. You were, in some twisted way, the most informed man in the county. And sometimes, only sometimes, that mattered. If a storm was coming, the mailman might be the first to warn folks. If a letter didn't arrive, he might ask around to see if it got lost in the shuffle. He didn't have a badge or a title, but he had a route. And that route was sacred. So each day, against logic and livestock, he laced up his boots, packed his letters, and stepped out the door into a world that was entirely unprepared to receive him. For all the barking, biting, and backaches, mailmen in 1855 weren't just carrying letters. Oh no, the American postal system, like the American spirit, was imaginative. People didn't just want correspondence. They wanted cargo. They wanted surprises. And sometimes, they wanted to send things that should never, under any moral or structural standard, be sent through the mail. Take eggs. Not figuratively. literal eggs. It wasn't uncommon for country folk to pack up a dozen duck or chicken eggs, nestled in straw, sealed with hope, and hand them over to the mailman with instructions to walk careful. These were often gifts, sometimes payments, occasionally part of a courtship. Were they wrapped? Sometimes. Were they protected? Barely. Did they survive? Rarely. Mailmen learned how to hold their bags with a certain angle. Don't jostle too much. Don't swing the satchel. Don't sit down too fast on a stump or the letter from Aunt Clara might get scrambled alongside 6 farm fresh pullets. One mailman in New Hampshire was asked to deliver a live turtle. No explanation, no box, just a turtle. He carried it in a boot for 2 miles and dropped it off still blinking. And then there were proposals. You might think of 1855 as a time of modesty and propriety. And you'd be right, but not when it came to the mail. Rural Americans were romantic. And isolated. And frequently lonely. Letters often included flirtations, poems, declarations, and now and then, outright marriage proposals. Sometimes they were for the intended recipient. Sometimes, they were for the mailman. Yes, carriers themselves occasionally received anonymous notes slipped into their own satchels. One bachelor mailman in Indiana reported receiving a folded card that simply read, "You may collect your kiss upon next delivery." Another found a slice of pie with a ribbon around it and a note saying, "You don't bite nearly as hard as the goose does." It's unclear whether any of these admirers ever became spouses. Most mailmen were too tired, too muddy, or too preoccupied with animal evasion to take romantic advances seriously. But they kept the notes, and occasionally reread them on long routes, just to remember that someone, somewhere, appreciated them. Of course, not all deliveries were charming. Some involved complaints. Not formal complaints, mind you. This was 1855. These were handwritten rants left in tin boxes or nailed to fence posts. They might say things like, "Why are my letters always damp? Tell that goose it's lucky I'm Christian." The last envelope was chewed. "If I find out it was the pig again, I'm keeping my own mail. Please do not sing while approaching the house. It disturbs the hens." Mailmen, to their credit, rarely responded. But some got creative. One carved a wooden token and left it in a complaining neighbor's box with the words, "This is your refund. Do not spend it all at once." Then there were the mystery packages, wrapped bundles that rattled, leaked, or pulsed unnaturally. One mailman opened a parcel to find a taxidermied squirrel wearing a bow tie. Another discovered a jar of cure-all tonic that was actually just whiskey, vinegar, and several peppercorns. He drank it anyway. And occasionally, very occasionally, the package wasn't for anyone at all. Just a box, no address, no return, placed on a porch with a note, "For whomever needs it." Inside, mittens. Or a locket. Or an unfinished prayer stitched into linen. Because even in a world of biting animals and frozen boots, people were still people. They tried to be kind. They tried to remember birthdays. They tried to send good news. And sometimes a potato wrapped in newspaper just to make someone laugh. Mailmen became part of that rhythm. Not just couriers, but characters. Everyone in town knew their gait, their hat, the way they folded the corner of an envelope just so. Children watched them like clockwork. Old men greeted them with grunts. Women left cooling pies on windowsills that just so happened to coincide with mail time. So yes, the job came with hazards. But it also came with stories. Every dog bite became legend. Every goose chase a saga. Every muddy mile walked in the dark became another thread in the strange, stubborn fabric of American life. And the mailmen? They just kept walking. As the decades passed, some things changed. Slowly. Painfully. Reluctantly. By the late 1850s and into the 1860s, the U.S. Postal Service began experimenting with more structured uniforms and official delivery guidelines. New regulations suggested proper boots, encouraged standardized satchels. There were even murmurs about issuing whistles to mailmen, not for defense, but to signal arrivals. The idea was that perhaps if you warned the geese, they might be gentler. They weren't. Despite modest reforms, the essentials remained the same: long roads, wild yards, unpredictable animals, and humans who always wanted their mail now. If anything, expectations grew faster than safety did. Mailmen were given more houses, longer routes, tighter deadlines. Some now had to deliver twice a day, despite having just one pair of boots and a digestive system fueled by dried apples and watery broth. And as towns grew, the homes multiplied, which meant more porches, more dogs, more geese. But by now, the mailmen were legends. They had reputations, nicknames, even mythologies. Old Jed in Maine, who once outran a bull by jumping into a creek with all his letters tied to his waist. Whistling Joe in Kentucky, who played a harmonica to calm the dogs and the mothers. Sally Pike in Iowa, the first woman on a rural star route, who carried her mail in a fishing net and once beamed a goose with a frying pan. Communities began to recognize their carriers, not as employees, but as fixtures. Trusted, odd, beloved. Children drew pictures of them in school. Shopkeepers set aside scraps and coffee for them. Even the cranky farmer who hated everyone somehow found a way to grumble thanks as the day's correspondence landed in his bucket. And in some places, people did the impossible. They tied up their dogs. Just on mail days. Just for a few hours. But it was something. One family in Pennsylvania reportedly rang a small bell when the mailman approached so the livestock and children would clear the yard. Geese, however, could not be tamed. They remained the final challenge. The last boss. The feathery gatekeepers of the American frontier. Mailmen began naming them. Lucifer, Captain Screech, Wiggles the White Demon. Some kept tallies in notebooks. One even sketched each offending goose in profile. The one from Elkin's Hollow has a limp but still charges with fury. Another wrote, "The red-eyed one by the mill follows me home if I walk too slow. Will report if it speaks human words." Despite the danger, mailmen kept walking. They learned to walk softly in winter, so snow wouldn't alert the hounds. They learned to wear bright colors in spring, so turkeys wouldn't mistake them for rivals. They learned to knock in patterns, so residents knew it was the mailman and not a traveling fence seller or worse, a census taker. And they learned to laugh. Some kept journals filled not with addresses, but anecdotes. One man wrote only in haiku. Goose behind barrel. Today it wore mother's hat. I fear no longer. Another, in a quieter moment, described his work like this. I do not bring only news. I bring evidence that the world still spins, that people still think of each other, that somebody, somewhere, folded paper with care and wrote a name in hope. The bite marks on the envelope? Just proof of the journey. Which, in the end, is what it always was, a journey. From one home to another. Across frozen bridges. Through fog that wrapped the world in silence. Past barking dogs and furious birds. Through towns too small for maps and too stubborn for change. And the mailman of 1855, unpaid, underfed, unthanked, still delivered. Not because it was easy. Not because it was glamorous. But because someone had to do it, and they were the ones holding the satchel. So, what did the world owe the mailman of 1855? A few coins, now and then. A slice of pie on lucky days. Maybe a pair of wool mittens knit by a grandmother who'd finally received a letter from her son in Michigan. But mostly, it owed them nothing. And that's what made their work so strange. So noble. So wonderfully absurd. Because this wasn't war, or glory, or invention. It was just delivering letters. Except, it wasn't. Each envelope was a private world, sealed and hopeful. A marriage proposal scribbled in pencil. A doctor's note folded into thirds. A recipe shared between cousins who hadn't seen each other in years. A simple, looping "we arrived safely." The mailman carried all these tiny lives in his satchel. And to get them where they were going, he had to walk straight into a yard with a three-legged mastiff named Butcher and a goose called Miss Priscilla. You didn't just need legs. You needed timing, instinct, luck, and, often, a stick. Yet the mail kept moving. Every morning, across the crunch of frost and the spit of rain. Across porches warped by weather and creaking like secrets. Through villages where people knew your footsteps better than your face. And even when the mailman didn't show. When the river flooded, or the snow swallowed the roads. Or the geese formed a blockade too fierce to challenge. The townspeople didn't get angry. They worried. Maybe he's lost. Maybe he fell. Maybe he's lying in a ditch clutching our mail like a holy scroll. Because by then, the mailman wasn't a stranger anymore. He was part of the rhythm of things. Like the smell of bread in the morning. Like the church bell at noon. Like the wind that knew all your secrets but never spoke them aloud. And slowly, the world changed. Fences got taller. Yards got tidier. People bought doorbells. By the 1880s and 1890s, regulations tightened. Dogs were more often leashed. Geese, for the most part, were invited off the front lawn and into the pot. Mailmen got real uniforms. Hats with stiff brims. Badges, sometimes. A few even got pensions. But the stories from 1855 didn't vanish. They lived in family lore, passed down like heirlooms made of mud and string. They say Grandpa once delivered letters through a thunderstorm with a gander pecking at his heels. They say he kept going even when the hounds tore his pants and the snow reached his knees. They say he never lost a single letter. And maybe, just maybe, that was true. Because the early mailmen, the ragtag postmen of wood-plank porches and geese-infested homesteads, weren't just deliverers. They were quiet champions of continuity, fierce defenders of little things. Proof that even in a chaotic world filled with barking and honking and biting, there would always be someone walking down the path, muddy boots and all, with a letter just for you. And as we drift off now, imagining those letters being tucked gently into wooden mail slots, or dropped into a tin pail nailed to a tree, as we hear, faintly, the creak of a gate and the flap of a feathered wing, we might wonder, would we have had the courage to walk through those yards, day after day, just to hand over someone else's message? Would we have braved the barking? Or would we have stood at the edge of the yard, watching the geese, and said, maybe tomorrow,